Welcome to the Double Knitting Board Sampler video series. The series will cover a number of projects from small to large: coaster, pot holder, classic scarf, keyhole scarf, and blanket. Oops, almost forgot. You can make a shawl out of this series too. Basically, anything with a rectangle shape can be knitted using the techniques and skills I'm about to demonstrate. We will use plain double board stockinette and also learn to knit stripes, Fair Isle dots, Fair Isle checks in 2 sizes, mock cable stitch, another textural stitch I call the hitch stitch, and intarsia hearts. I will also show you how to create a keyhole so that you can slide one scarf end through it to create a classic keyhole scarf. We'll also cover a neat cast-on and bind-off technique so that the two ends match. You may use any double knitting board in any gauge. The loom on the back is adjustable. Many are, because we can space the boards at different widths, and that will affect stitch size. The two in the front are fixed, so we have to accept the gauge we get and just pick an appropriate yarn. It's important to understand gauge. Many people talk about peg spacing and believe that to be gauge, but it is only part of the story. The distance between the boards, actually between the rows of pegs, because they might be positioned differently on the boards, also plays a part, as does the circumference of the peg itself. So it's helpful to think in terms of the total trip that the yarn makes. Here's an experiment that will illustrate. I have wrapped 10 pegs on each loom and knotted the ends of the yarn where they end. At first glance, these two looms look fairly similar in size. But look what happens when we compare the lengths of the yarn that it took to wrap 10 pegs. Very, very different. So obviously the pink yarn, which was wrapping the Kiss loom, is going to create smaller stitches, a tighter gauge of fabric, because the shorter the trip that the yarn makes, the smaller the stitches will be. One end of the yarn is still attached to the loom, then I lift it off the wraps, and the arrows are pointing to where the other end attached to the loops when the wraps were on there and complete. These two looms look quite different. The spacing between the pegs is different, the size of the pegs, and the front loom has pegs much more widely spaced than the back loom. But surprise, the length of yarn consumed to wrap 10 pegs is almost identical, so they'll knit to similar gauge. With that in mind, the best way to size your project so that it comes out predictable is to knit a swatch, then measure how many stitches per inch are you getting and how many rows. This example is very easy to visualize because I know I knitted my checks 4 stitches wide, and that takes up an inch, so we're getting 4 stitches per inch. I know I knitted the checks 5 rows long, and that also takes up an inch, so I know we're getting 5 rows per inch. It's quite common to have more rows per inch than stitches per inch. Projects such as these are just squares and rectangles, so it's a very simple process. Multiply desired width by stitches per inch and desired length by rows per inch to get the stitch and row counts you should use. These projects are excellent practice for learning to predict size because they're not terribly fussy. Typically, a pot holder would be about 6 inches square, possibly as much as 8. But do we honestly care if it comes out 6 or 6¼ inches? We don't. Ditto scarves and blankets. There is a range, a greater acceptable range than there is for a sweater. So just swatch, measure, do the simple math, and don't worry. Users of the Answer Lady and Friends app will have access to free notes too. Adjustable gauge looms normally have a bolt with some spacers between the boards and a nut that holds the bolt in place at a certain position. People who own those have the option of adding or subtracting spacers, often washers, to get the ideal gauge. So, what constitutes ideal gauge? If you are trying to make a fitted garment and use somebody else's pattern, ideal gauge is matching the gauge given in the pattern to get a predictable fit. But for these projects, I would think of it this way. I like my scarves to drape softly, so that takes a somewhat loosely knitted fabric. I want the pot holder to keep my hands away from the hot pot handle, so I want that to be quite densely knitted. And I would like the blanket somewhere in between, so that it will hold its shape but still trap air, which is what makes a blanket warm. So it's something of a personal judgment call and a personal taste issue. I suggest that you select a yarn you like, swatch, and make sure that you're getting a fabric you like with that yarn on that loom. And for these projects, just do the arithmetic from that point. They are not all that fussy.